All right, you may begin.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, Your Honor.
So let's call the case of Stevie Rogers v. Drew Mars. My name is Judge Zachary Marshall Carter. Scoring judges, please look to the two buttons on the lower left of your screen and remember to keep your audio and video off unless the bailiff tells you otherwise. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants. This means the only people on the screen right now should be the advocates and me. Let's start with appearances from the plaintiff.
Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Shirley Song, along with my co-counsel, Jacqueline Rayfield.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
We'll be representing the plaintiff in today's case, Stevie Rogers.
Morning, Your Honor.
Good morning. And then let's hear from the defense that your appearances.
Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Julie Howard, and I, along with my co-counsel, Mr. Kendall Beard,
Good morning, Your Honor.
will be representing the defendant in today's case, Ms. Drew Mars.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning. So does the plaintiff, let's start with the plaintiff. Do you have any pretrial matters to attend to before we get started?
Yes, Your Honor. First, we'd like to draw the court's attention to the fact that exhibits 1 through 7 are already pre-admitted. So they may be used for any purpose at any time during trial. And of note in those exhibits, those include the autopsy report and toxicology screening, as well as a photograph and floor plan of Lee Manor and the Lee detective's report.
Okay, is that your understanding, defense counsel?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, so I'll note that those are admitted.
Also, Your Honor, we'd like to ask if you have any preferences in terms of counsel being seated or standing for statements or examinations, or if we should ask permission before sharing the screen for any exhibits.
I'm gonna let you guys make your choices on that. So whatever you decide. If the document hasn't been admitted, I'd make sure you lay foundation and admit it before you share it on the screen. But other than that, everything else is up to you.
So just to be clear, Your Honor, we would like to show the witness to see if they recognize it before moving it into evidence. Could we constructively just pretend that's out of the eyeshot of the jury?
Yeah, we could do that. That works.
And also, we'd like to invoke Rule 615, the constructive sequestration of all witnesses barring party representatives. Our party representative is going to be Stevie Rogers.
Okay, defense, do you have a party representative?
Yes, Your Honor. Our party representative is the defendant, Drew Mars.
Okay.
And with that, the plaintiff is ready to go.
Okay, defense counsel, do you have any other pretrial matters to attend to?
I just have one quick clarification, Your Honor. When it comes to sitting and standing, is it permissible for us to say sitting while we're making an objection as well?
Yes, that's totally fine with me.
Okay, well then we're ready to go, Your Honor.
Okay, let me pull up my script here. Okay, we will now hear opening statements from each party. Everyone should make sure that they are in speaker view. That button is in the upper right of your corner. Attorneys, please remember to mute your audio when the other attorney is speaking. So I'll go to speaker view and plaintiff counsel, you're ready to proceed with opening statements?
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. The defendant switched the pills to secure the money. Throughout today's case, you're going to hear a lot about the actions of Drew Mars, the defendant. How Drew poisoned Agatha Lee in order to secure her fortune. But before we get into all that, I want to remind you what today's trial is really about. We're here to discuss a family that faced unimaginable tragedy. And I want you to meet that family today. Stevie Rogers and his grandmother, Agatha Lee. Members of the jury, you're going to hear today about an unbreakable bond between these two. A bond built throughout Stevie's happy childhood. But this family was rocked in 2008 by the tragic death of Stevie's mother and Agatha's daughter. After this accident, you'll hear that Stevie was lost and Agatha Lee was inconsolable. But that even after years apart, the two had a connection that couldn't be broken. And when Stevie returned to his grandmother's doorstep in 2018, they were as close as ever. But members of the jury, there was one person who stood in the way of their chance for a happy reunion. The defendant, Drew Mars. Mars was Miss Lee's caretaker from 2008 to 2018, and you're going to hear today that Mars and Miss Lee were close. So close that while Stevie was away, Drew Mars became the beneficiary on Miss Lee's will. And you'll hear today that Mars desperately needed that money to help a fatally ill sibling. Which brings us to the day of August 14th, members of the jury, the day that Miss Lee died. I want to take you to a conversation that happened that morning, and I want to Mars was walking to the study with the cup of tea that she brings Agatha every morning, and Stevie and his grandmother were talking inside the study. Miss Lee told her only grandchild she wanted to change her will, to leave her fortune, her legacy, to her only grandson, Stevie. Listening outside the door, Mars knew in that moment she had to do something, anything, to secure the money. You'll hear that Mars immediately drove to a pharmacy. She purchased a medication called chloroandramine, one she knew Miss Lee was deathly allergic to. That night, she switched the pills in Miss Lee's pillbox with this deadly dose, and she snuck into Miss Lee's room later that night to poison her. By the end of the night, members of the jury, Miss Lee was dead. And sure enough, Mars inherited the $20 million. Members of the jury, Drew Mars may still get away with a crime today, but don't let her get away with the money too. Now that's where you come in, members of the jury, because today we're suing Miss Mars on something called the Slayer statute. And this law states that if, members of the jury, you find today that Miss Mars killed Miss Lee, then Miss Mars cannot inherit her millions. And I want to be very clear about what we have to prove to you today, because today's case is not a criminal murder trial, it's a civil case. So all we have to prove to you is that Mars acted in a way that she knew or hoped would cause the death of Miss Lee. And we have to prove this to you today by what's called a preponderance of the evidence, a simple tip of the scales. So if at the end of today's trial, you find it is even slightly more likely than not that Drew Mars killed Agatha Lee, then we have met our burden today. And Miss Mars won't walk away with her stolen millions. And today, members of the jury, we're going to meet that burden by calling two witnesses. First, you're going to hear from Stevie Rogers himself. Stevie will describe his relationship with his grandmother, how they were reconnecting after years torn apart by tragedy. But he will also tell you that Mars was jealous of that relationship and that he saw Drew Mars sneak into his grandmother's room on the night of August 14th to switch those pills that would kill her. Next, members of the jury, you're going to hear from Murphy Bond, the detective on the case. And Detective Bond will tell you that Drew Mars had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to kill Miss Lee. He will also tell you that chloroandramine pills, those same pills that killed Miss Lee, were found in Mars' closet. Members of the jury, today you have the chance to grant justice to a grieving grandchild. After so much tragedy, from the sudden death of his parents to the untimely death of his grandmother, today Stevie can finally get peace a peace that comes with knowing that the person who killed his grandmother can't steal her legacy too. So at the end of today's trial, find in favor of the plaintiff. Thank you.
Thank you, plaintiff counsel. Is the defense ready for their opening?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Yep, you may proceed.
Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. She was the one in the way, and because she was the one in the will. Drew Mars was the one that took care of Agatha Lee when she suffered a severe heart attack. Miss Mars was the one that would cook breakfast every Saturday morning with Miss Lee as they sang their hearts out to Frank Sinatra. Miss Mars was the one that held Agatha every year on the anniversary of her daughter's death. Drew Mars wasn't just a caretaker. She was family to Agatha Lee, which is why she was the one that Agatha Lee left everything to in the will. Now, Miss Rayfield, she just came up here and told you a story about how Mr. Rogers loved his grandmother. But members of the jury, rest assured, Mr. Rogers didn't love his grandmother for who she was, but for what she had. You see, to Mr. Rogers, Drew Mars was the one standing in between him and his inheritance. Drew Mars was the one standing in between the way of him and $20 million. Drew Mars was in the way. And he would stop at nothing to get her out of the picture. And now, members of the jury, we actually agree with Ms. Rayfield. There is someone in this courtroom that caused the death of Agatha Lee. But that someone's name isn't Drew Mars. That someone isn't sitting at defense counsel table. That someone is going to get up before you and testify for the plaintiff. And Ms. Rayfield talked a little bit about the Slayer statute. Mr. Rogers understood that because he wasn't in the will, he needed a way out. He needed a way to get the inheritance. So what did he do? Well, he knew that if he could prove that Miss Lee was killed, that he would get all of the inheritance money. So that's when he enacted his plan. Members of the jury, you're going to learn today that he hired a private investigator to help him concoct this plan, to help him plant evidence, and to help him take the money. Now, I know what you might be asking yourself, why? Why would Mr. Rogers kill his grandmother? Well, members of the jury, you're going to learn today that Mr. Rogers was living lavish. He spent over $2 million completely draining his trust fund. But members of the jury, what's $2 million when you're set to inherit $20 million? Or so we thought. Members of the jury, you're going to learn today about a letter. And in this letter, Miss Lee actually wrote Stevie Rogers out of the will. Miss Lee told him that she wasn't going to leave him a dime. Well, Mr. Rogers didn't know what to do. Mr. Rogers was broke. Mr. Rogers needed a plan. He planned the perfect murder. And who else to pin it on but the person in the will? And she was the one in the way because she was the one in the will. And now, Ms. Rayfield got up here and told you about what they have to prove to you today. It's by preponderance of the evidence, which means more likely than not. But members of the jury, she said that it was just a slight tipping of the scale, and she's right, but you need to evaluate the credibility of their evidence. When they talk to you today, when they introduce witnesses, evaluate the credibility of the evidence they're bringing before you, because that's the only evidence you can weigh, members of the jury. So at the end of the trial, if they're credible evidence, it doesn't make it more likely than not that Miss Mars was responsible or had something to do with Agatha Lee's death, then you have to find Miss Mars not liable. And I'm confident that at the end of today's trial, that's the only verdict that will be supported by the evidence. And now, members of the jury, I want you to listen closely in today's case. And you're gonna hear about the strained relationship between Mr. Rogers and his grandmother. We're gonna call Drew Mars today, and she's gonna tell you how she was Miss Lee's caretaker for years, and she never saw Stevie Rogers. She's gonna tell you about how Stevie Rogers used Miss Lee for money. We're gonna hear from Rhian Cabrera, a personal author that spent much time with Agatha Lee, helping write her biography. He's gonna corroborate that story. And he worked with Miss Lee for years, and he's gonna tell you that he never saw Stevie Rogers. And Miss Rayfield kind of talked to you about a conversation that happened between Miss Lee and Mr. Rogers. She's right. That conversation did happen, but members of the jury, it didn't happen the way Miss Rayfield described it. Listen closely as we call Drew Mars today, and she tells you that she heard Miss Lee say, "I'm writing you out of my will. You're not getting a dime." And you're gonna learn from Miss Mars today that Mr. Rogers walked out of that room and looked at her. "Don't count your millions yet," is what Mr. Rogers said. And you're also gonna hear that story corroborated by Mr. Cabrera, who's gonna tell you that Miss Lee had a conversation with him about how she had to tell Mr. Rogers no. But members of the jury, when you're thinking about this conversation and as it's introduced in trial, I want you to keep a question in your mind. Can anyone else corroborate this conversation? Did anyone else hear the testimony that Stevie Rogers is going to tell you today? And we're confident that no one will be able to. Members of the jury, I want you to consider something. When you hear the testimony today, consider Stevie Rogers' motive. Consider how one of the plaintiff's witnesses was hired by Stevie Rogers. Consider the credibility of their evidence. Consider the credibility of their case. Consider the credibility of their evidence. Because members of the jury, I want you to remember something. As you go back in that jury deliberation room at the end of this trial, I want you to remember who was there for Agatha Lee in her darkest times, when she needed her the most, and who was always there for her. And I want you to remember who came in her life when he ran out of money and he ran out of options. She was the one in the way because she was the one in the will. Now, at the end of today's trial, my co-counsel, Julie Howard, is going to walk you through each and every piece of evidence. And she's going to ask that you find the verdict that all the evidence point towards, not liable. Thank you.
Thank you, defense counsel. Before the plaintiff calls its first witness, I will ask everyone to switch to gallery view. That button is in the upper right of your screen. This will allow you to see the attorneys and witness at the same time. Okay, so plaintiff, are you ready?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Stevie Rogers.
Okay, Ms. Rogers, or Mr. Rogers. You may proceed.
Please introduce yourself to the court.
Hello, my name is Stevie Rogers.
Mr. Rogers, why are we here today?
On August 15th, 2018, I found my grandmother dead. I'm suing her former caretaker, Drew Mars.
Mr. Rogers, can you tell us a little bit about your grandmother?
Of course, she was Agatha Lee. You probably know her as the mysterious one-hit wonder author of Death in a Bottle.
And can you tell us a little bit more about your family?
So Agatha was my grandma on my mom's side. My mom was Veronica. Growing up, we were all really close, but that changed once my parents passed.
And when did your parents pass away?
July 4th, 2008. Car accident.
How did that impact you, Mr. Rogers?
At the time, I was getting ready to graduate college. Not having them there for that or for me starting law school, safe to say it hurt a lot.
Mr. Rogers, can you tell us what your relationship was like with your grandmother after your parents' passing?
Seeing my grandma brought up a lot of memories that I just wasn't ready to deal with. We didn't speak for a long time after, but I changed that in July 2018.
Did you communicate with your grandmother before 2018?
Every now and again. In February 2018, Grandma sent me a letter explaining that she had written me out of her will.
Mr. Rogers, would you recognize copies of that will and the previous one if I showed it to you today?
Yeah, I would.
Your Honor, at this time, I'm going to display the wills constructively outside of the eye shot of the jury.
Okay.
Mr. Rogers, what have we just shown you?
The one on the left that says Exhibit 8 is Grandma's will from 2008, and the one on the right that says Exhibit 9 is her will from 2018.
Do these look like fair and accurate copies of those wills as you remember them?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the plaintiff moves Exhibit 8 and 9 into evidence.
Any objections?
No objection from the defense, Your Honor.
Okay, so Exhibit 8 and 9 are entered.
Mr. Rogers, can you tell us a little bit about the change in these wills?
Sure. Basically, the only change is that in the 2008 version, I was listed as the beneficiary. And in 2018, Grandma changed that to be Drew Mars.
And how did you feel about that change, Mr. Rogers?
It was tough. Growing up, her and I were so close, and it hurt me thinking that maybe how I was behaving had hurt her so much that she did this. I wanted to fix it.
Well, how did you want to fix it?
By just going to her. I found out that she had moved from Alabama to Midlands, and as soon as I found out where she was, I went to her right away.
And when did you arrive at your grandmother's house?
July 4th, 2018, the 10-year anniversary of my parents' death.
Mr. Rogers, how did it feel to be back with your grandmother after your parents' death?
It felt really nice. It felt like we were falling back into our old routine really quickly.
And how much time did you spend together during this visit?
Oh, like all day. Every meal together, games, movies, everything.
Was there anyone else living in the house at that time?
Yeah, Drew Mars.
Did you know Drew Mars before you came to visit that time?
Not really. I knew that she was the person listed in Grandma's will and that she was Grandma's caretaker.
Did Drew and you spend any time together while you were at the mansion?
Not really. To be honest, I never really felt welcomed by Drew.
What do you mean you never felt welcomed by Drew?
From the moment I got there, I felt very uncomfortable around her. She would either ignore me during conversations or cut me off in the middle of while I was talking.
What, did it ever get worse?
Yeah, by the second week, she was asking me over and over again if I was going to be leaving soon, how long I was planning on staying.
Mr. Rogers, I want to move on to specifically the day of August 14th, the day that your grandmother passed away. How did that day start?
I made Grandma her favorite breakfast in the morning, and then we spent the rest of the morning chatting, playing cards in her study. Eventually, the conversation turned to something more serious.
What do you mean something more serious?
We started talking about Grandma's will.
What did your grandmother say about the will?
Grandma told me that she was so happy to have me back, and that she was planning to call her lawyer soon to change her will back to name me as the beneficiary.
I want to pause for a minute, Mr. Rogers. After your grandmother told you she planned to change her will to make you the beneficiary, was there anyone else in the room?
No, it was just us two in the room.
To your knowledge, did anyone else hear this conversation?
I couldn't tell you for sure, but I can tell you that Drew's behavior once we left the study made me really nervous.
Well, how was Drew behaving?
As soon as we walked out, she was just staring at me. I could see that her eyes were bloodshot and her face was flushed. I looked down and I saw that her fists were clenched.
Did she say anything?
Not exactly. But she looked at me right in the eyes and she mouthed, "No way."
Mr. Rogers, I know this might be difficult, but I want to talk about the night your grandmother died, later that day. Can you tell us what happened that night?
We had a pretty early dinner. Again, we were just hanging out. And then around 9:30, I told Grandma that I was going to spend some time out in the study in my room, and I left her.
And did anything else happen when you left your grandmother?
I was sitting in the sitting area just outside of her room, and then I saw Drew Mars in the hallway.
Mr. Rogers, what did you see Drew Mars doing on the night your grandmother died?
She was sort of tiptoeing from her room to Grandma's room, and she had her right hand up like this. It looked to me like she was holding something, but I never saw if she was.
Mr. Rogers, what time was that you saw Drew Mars going into your grandmother's room?
9:35, 9:40.
I want to just pause for a minute again. Mr. Rogers, do you know what time your grandmother ingested chlorandramine that night? What time your grandmother died?
The autopsy report said she died between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m. that night.
And how exactly did she die, Mr. Rogers?
She had a deadly allergy to something called chlorandramine. It's a heartburn medicine. The tox screen said that she ingested 2 pills and it caused a heart attack.
I want to go back to that night. Do you know what Drew Mars was doing in your grandmother's room at around 9:35?
No, I have absolutely no idea. And at the time, I just thought she was doing what she normally did, but no, I really have no idea.
Mr. Rogers, did you know about your grandmother's allergy to chloroandramine?
Yeah, I did.
And how did you learn about it?
Drew Mars told me.
Mr. Rogers, who is usually in charge of giving your grandmother her medication?
Drew Mars.
And Mr. Rogers, who had given your grandmother medication throughout that week?
Drew Mars.
Objection, lack of foundation.
Response?
Your Honor, this witness has testified that he saw his grandmother taking medication, that he was there for a period of time in July and August of 2018. It's well within his scope of reference to say who usually gave his grandmother her medication.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Yes.
Your Honor, the witness just testified that throughout that week, it was Drew Mars who was giving his grandmother the medication. There's been no foundation laid that he ever saw his grandmother take medication or who was giving medication that week.
Okay, I'm gonna sustain the objection to that point and just ask you to lay that one question of foundation if you had seen that actually happen.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Rogers, did you ever see Drew Mars give your grandmother her medication that week?
I'm sorry, you cut out a little bit.
Pardon. Mr. Rogers, did you ever see Drew Mars give your grandmother medication that week?
Yes, I did. And I saw her organizing her pills.
Thank you, Your Honor. We have no further questions.
Okay, thank you, plaintiff counsel. Cross-examination from the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Yes.
Mr. Rogers, I just want to make something clear. When Drew Mars was written into your grandmother's will, you lost over $20 million. Isn't that true?
Not exactly. I never had that money to begin with.
But up until 2018, you were the sole inheritor of that money.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until 2018 that you were written out of that will. Isn't that true?
In 2018, that's when Grandma changed it. You're right.
Now, Mr. Rogers, you said something very interesting on direct that I just wanted to bring up. You said that the reason you went to go visit your grandmother was because you felt so bad about that letter that she sent you. Is that what you said?
Not exactly. I said I felt bad about the way I had been behaving over that time.
Because of the letter that she sent you, that's the reason that you felt bad about it, true?
No, it was more just a realization of what I was doing.
But Mr. Rogers, you said you realized that because of the letter.
It was after I got the letter, yeah.
Mr. Rogers, you received that letter in February of 2018, right?
Yes.
But you didn't go to visit your grandmother until June of 2018.
It was July.
But you didn't start trying to visit your grandmother until June of 2018.
Yes, that's right.
Mr. Rogers, let's talk about what was going on in June of 2018. You had just gone broke.
No, not exactly.
Well, Mr. Rogers, your trust fund had just run out.
No, it hadn't yet.
In June 2018, your trust fund ran out. Isn't that true?
Oh, I still had some cash and some valuables.
But your trust fund only had $2 million in it, right?
In June of 2018?
Your original trust fund had $2 million.
Yes.
And in June 2018, you had burned through all $2 million of that trust fund. Yes or no?
No.
Mr. Rogers, is it your testimony today that you still had money in that trust fund in June of 2018?
I was almost out, but I still had some cash left.
Mr. Rogers, do you have your deposition in front of you?
Yeah, I do. It's on the computer.
Is that your name on the top of your deposition?
I'm sorry. Just give me 1 second. Yes, it is.
And that's your signature on the last page?
No, there's no signature, but I think this is my deposition, yeah.
You remember being deposed?
I do.
Mr. Rogers, I'm going to read you line 34 of your deposition. Are you there?
That's on page 1 or 2?
2.
Okay.
Question. When did your trust fund run out? Answer, June 2018. Now, Mr. Rogers, it was only after your trust fund ran out that you went to go visit your grandmother.
I'm sorry. The next line, it says I still had some cash. That's what I was trying to say. I'm sorry.
But it was only after your trust fund ran out that you went to go visit your grandmother. Yes or no?
I went in July.
And what you say that when you went to go visit your grandmother, she was going to give you all the money in that will again.
No, I didn't say that.
You said that when you had a conversation with your grandmother after you visited her, she said she was going to put you back in that will.
Yes, that was the conversation we had in August.
Mr. Rogers, I just want to talk about your relationship with her before that conversation.
Okay.
You had gone to visit her that summer. You hadn't visited her once in almost a decade. Isn't that true?
That's right.
You hadn't written her one email during that time.
Like I mentioned, seeing and speaking to her brought up some tough memories. But you're right.
You hadn't called her. You called her once during those 10 years.
Yeah, I called her in 2017.
So you say after not speaking to your grandmother after 10 years, she was just willing to hand over her entire estate to you again.
Well, it hadn't been 10 years. And it was after over a month of us spending time together every day.
Mr. Rogers, it had been at least 8 years since you had spoken to her.
I just told you I talked to her in 2017.
That one phone call?
Yes.
Mr. Rogers, we have no one. You haven't provided us anyone who can corroborate that that conversation actually happened. The conversation where she said she was going to put you back in that will.
Well, I'm sure she might have called her lawyer.
But you can't provide us with anyone who can corroborate that.
I'm just myself, yes.
For all we know, she could have told you were never getting back in that will.
She didn't say that, though.
Well, for all we know, she could have told you that Drew Mars would always be the one in that will.
She told me that she was going to be changing it.
But, Mr. Rogers, if that had happened, if she had told you that she wasn't going to change it, you knew that there was another way to get that money.
No, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that.
Well, you knew about the Slayer statue, didn't you?
I know what that is, yeah.
You knew that if you could convince a court that Drew Mars had murdered your grandmother, you would get all of that $20 million estate.
That's what I decided to do after my grandmother died. You're right.
But you knew about that before you even got to your grandmother's house. Isn't that true?
I learned about it in law school, if that's what you mean.
You knew about that statute when Drew Mars first became the inheritor of that will.
Yeah, I had learned about it in 2011 during law school.
And you filed this lawsuit under that same statute the day that her will was read.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Rogers, you didn't just know about that statute. You also knew about your grandmother's fatal allergy to chlorandramine.
Like I said, Drew is the one that told me.
You knew that if your grandmother took any chlorandramine, she could die.
Drew told me that the allergy was really deadly. You're right.
Mr. Rogers, you know that ultimately that's exactly how she died.
That's what I found out from the talk screen that I requested, yes.
Mr. Rogers, you found out about your grandmother's fatal allergy to that medicine the first week of August. Isn't that true?
Yeah, Drew Mars just brought it up in the middle of a conversation. It was really uncomfortable. We weren't even talking about that.
Mr. Rogers, I know you want to talk about Miss Mars, but I'm just asking about you right now. You found out about her allergy to that medicine the first week of August.
Yes, like I said.
And your grandmother was poisoned with that same medicine on August 15th.
That's right.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. I have no further questions.
Any redirect from the plaintiff?
Briefly, Your Honor.
Okay.
Mr. Rogers, on cross-examination, you were asked a little bit about the money that you had in June of 2018. Do you want to clarify for us what exactly you had at that point?
Sure. So in June 2018, I still had a little bit of cash left. I had a car I could have sold, some collectible watches from, passed down through the generations of my family. And I was working on publishing a couple of books.
Mr. Rogers, we have no further questions.
Okay, any recross on that?
No recross, Your Honor.
Okay, so plaintiff, you ready to call your next witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls Murphy Bond.
Okay.
And may I proceed?
Yes, you may.
Please introduce yourself to the jury.
Certainly. Good morning, everybody. My name is Murphy Bond.
Mr. Bond, what do you do for a living?
Well, I'm a licensed private investigator and consulting detective, certified in 13 states, including Midlands. Essentially, I assist clients in providing supplemental investigations.
What experience do you have in the field?
Well, at this point, I've been a licensed private investigator for over a decade now and worked dozens of cases.
So how are you involved in today's case?
Well, I was hired by Mr. Rogers to investigate the death of Agatha Lee as a suspected instance of foul play.
Well, when did you first become involved?
I was first made aware of this case on August 15th, shortly after Miss Lee was found dead in her home.
And how did you start your investigation?
Well, I started by talking to the two people who were at that house. That would be Mr. Stevie Rogers and Miss Drew Mars.
Now, before we get any further, Mr. Bond, I just want to establish, did Miss Lee die of natural causes?
Unfortunately, the evidence is not consistent with that. The autopsy report revealed that she died from a fatal allergic reaction to a drug called chloroandramine. It's an over-the-counter heartburn medication.
Well, did you find any evidence as to how Miss Lee might have ingested those pills?
Well, there was one point, which is that chloroandramine happens to look identical to Miss Lee's arthritis pills. So if those two drugs were switched, it would be invisible to the naked eye.
Now, if Miss Lee didn't die of natural causes, how did you proceed to investigate this?
Well, with that in mind, I investigated this case as a likely instance of foul play. To that end, I investigated the classical triad of such investigations. That would be means, motive, and opportunity. I started with opportunity, which is to say I ascertained who could have possibly been in a position to end Agatha Lee's life.
Well, how did you narrow down who had that opportunity?
Well, in talking with the people at the house that day, I ascertained that around the time of Miss Lee's death, there were only two people present in the house. That would be Mr. Rogers and Miss Mars.
Now, Mr. Bond, you also mentioned means and motive. Which one did you go with next?
Next in my analysis was motive.
And did you find any evidence as to either Mr. Rogers or the defendant having a potential motive?
Well, there was one point that did come up in my investigation, which was that both parties were at some point in time involved with Miss Lee's inheritance and her will.
Would you recognize Miss Lee's two most recent wills if I were to display them?
I certainly would.
Ms. Rayfield, if you could please put up exhibits 8 and 9, these are already in evidence. Mr. Bond, do you recognize what's just been displayed?
I do. These are the wills that I was talking about.
And now, how do these two wills differ?
Well, the first will from 2008 simply leaves the entire estate to Miss Lee's next of kin. That would be Mr. Rogers. However, in 2018, there was a fairly significant change in that will, in that Stevie Rogers was removed, and in his place, Miss Mars became the sole inheritor.
Thank you, Ms. Rayfield. You can take that off the screen. Now, Mr. Bond, during your investigation, did the defendant ever communicate that they were aware of that latest will?
They communicated the opposite to me, in fact. During the reading of the will, they simply repeated, "I cannot believe this. I had no idea."
Did you find any evidence that contradicted the defendant's claim they had no idea about that latest will?
I did, yes. In the course of my investigation, I found an email written by the defendant that directly contradicts that.
Would you recognize a picture of that email if I were to display it?
I would.
Ms. Rayfield, if you could. Mr. Bond, do you recognize that on the screen?
Yes, this is a picture of the email that Ms. Mars sent. To clarify, I took this picture.
And is it the same as you last saw it?
It is, yes.
At this time, the plaintiff moves Exhibit 13 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objections, Your Honor.
Okay, so admitted.
Mr. Bond, what does this email say?
Well, in short, what it says here is exactly what they didn't say to me, that they did know about this will and that in the event of Agatha Lee's death, they would receive the inheritance and become a multimillionaire.
You can take that off the screen, Ms. Rayfield. Mr. Bond, I want to move on now to talk about means.
Certainly.
In your investigation, did you come across anyone who mentioned the drug chloroandramine?
Yes. In talking with the defendant about Ms. Lee's healthcare regimen, I discovered that Ms. Mars was aware that Ms. Lee was deathly allergic to chloroandramine.
And to the best of your knowledge, who had access to Ms. Lee's medications?
Well, Ms. Lee's medications for the week were generally stored in a pillbox in her bedroom. And Ms. Mars was the one who was responsible for refilling that organizer. Apologies.
Well, did you find any chloroandramine around the house?
Yes. In a search of the house, we found a bottle of such pills inside the defendant's closet.
And where exactly was that bottle in the closet?
It was inside a black fabric bag.
Did you run fingerprint analysis on that bag?
Well, during the investigation, Detective Khan with the Midlands Police Department ran a fingerprint analysis. There was fingerprints consistent with Ms. Drew Mars on the zipper of that bag.
Besides the defendant's fingerprints on the bag containing those pills, were anyone else's fingerprints on there?
No.
And did you find chloroandramine anywhere else in the house?
No, solely in the defendant's closet.
So, Mr. Bond, bringing together means, motive, and opportunity, what did they point to in the death of Agatha Lee?
Well, in short, my investigation pointed to Ms. Drew Mars. She had the means, being aware of this chloroandramine allergy, the motive with her involvement in this inheritance, and the opportunity, being present at the house right up until Agatha Lee's death.
And Mr. Bond, I want to bring you back to the morning of August 15th, just a bit after everyone found out that Miss Lee had passed. What was to happen to her body?
Well, it was slated to go to the funeral home, but Mr. Rogers objected, asking for an autopsy and a tox screen.
Well, can you conduct an autopsy or a tox screen on a body that's been cremated?
Well, I don't conduct autopsies, period. I won't oversell my qualifications. But as I understand it, a medical examiner generally does require a body to examine when they're examining a body.
Well, Mr. Bond, what did the defendant want to do with Agatha Lee's body?
She asked for the body to be cremated.
Thank you, Mr. Bond. No further questions.
Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Bond, I'm going to ask you a couple questions. Is that okay with you?
Of course.
Now, Mr. Bond, I kind of want to start with something you mentioned on your direct examination. And now you talked about motive, right?
That's correct.
Well, Mr. Bond, let's talk about your motive for testifying here today.
Certainly.
You were actually paid twice by Mr. Rogers, right?
Right. This is the second case I've been retained on.
Right. And the first time, he paid you $10,000 to locate his grandmother. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
And the second time he hired you was to conduct the investigation. Isn't that right?
That's correct. That's the case for which we are discussing right now.
And this time, he was going to pay you $25,000, right?
That's correct.
But Mr. Bond, you haven't received that payment yet, have you?
I have not, no.
You won't receive that payment until the conclusion of this case. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
Now, Mr. Bond, you talked about your investigative process and you talked about narrowing down suspects. Isn't that right?
I did, yes.
Mr. Bond, let's talk about one of your first suspects, Stevie Rogers himself, okay?
Certainly.
Now, Mr. Bond, when Stevie Rogers called you on August 15th, 2018, he told you his grandmother had been murdered, right?
That's correct. That's
Objection, Your Honor. Substantially more prejudicial than probative, if I may be heard.
Yes.
I would ask that opposing counsel refrains throughout this trial from using the word murder. That's just going to prejudice the jury into believing this is a criminal trial when that is not the issue at hand today. And therefore, we as the plaintiff have a much lower burden of more likely than not, rather than beyond a reasonable doubt.
May I be heard?
Yes.
Well, Your Honor, initially, for something to be more prejudicial than probative, the prejudicial value needs to substantially outweigh the probative value. Your Honor, this goes to show that Stevie Rogers understood that there had been foul play at stake before the police got there, before there was an autopsy report, and before there was a toxicology screening. And this is extremely probative to the members of the jury for them to understand the mindset of Stevie Rogers when he initially hired Mr. Bond to come and handle the investigation.
Response, Your Honor?
Yes.
Opposing counsel can convey the same meaning by just summarizing Stevie's quote as kill. The word murder is inherently entrenched in a criminal proceeding and therefore going to prejudice the jury. The probative value of this is low when they could use the word kill.
I'm going to overrule the objection. I think the jury can understand that we're in the civil case and we'll instruct them at the end of the trial as such. But I think it's important to get the plaintiff's words correct and exact in this case. So overruled.
I'll ask you again, Mr. Bond.
Certainly.
Mr. Rogers said that she had been murdered, right?
Right, he's suspected as such.
Now, Mr. Bond, the police hadn't even gotten to the scene yet, right?
That's correct.
And there had been no autopsy,
That's correct.
no toxicology screening.
Correct.
Mr. Bond, you didn't even know at that point if it was a murder or if she had died from natural causes. Isn't that right?
That is correct. I hadn't arrived at the scene yet.
Mr. Bond, I want to talk about the conversation that you said Mr. Rogers had with you. Is that okay?
Of course.
Now, Mr. Bond, you mentioned that Mr. Rogers told you that Agatha Lee said he was going to become the sole inheritor of the will.
Yes, that is correct.
And now, Mr. Bond, you conduct thorough investigations, right?
I do.
And thorough investigations oftentimes come with finding supplemental evidence to corroborate things, right?
That's correct.
Mr. Bond, did you find anyone that could corroborate that conversation?
I did not, no.
Well, Mr. Bond, you actually reviewed Detective Khan's report as well, right?
I did, yes.
Well, did he find anybody that corroborated that report, that conversation?
To the best of my knowledge, she did not.
So, Mr. Bond, the only person that confirmed that conversation that ever happened was Stevie Rogers himself.
That's correct.
You also talked to Drew Mars, right?
I did, discussing Agatha Lee's healthcare in the days and in the time before her death.
And you actually asked to search your room.
I did, yes.
But Ms. Mars told you no, right?
That's correct.
And after Ms. Mars told you no, she went to have a conversation with Detective Khan in Agatha Lee's room. Isn't that right?
Precisely.
Could I have Exhibit 5 up, please? So Stevie Rock, Drew Mars was in Agatha Lee's room talking to Detective Khan. Isn't that right?
Right, that's the one in the upper right corner there.
But Mr. Bond, you weren't quite done with Miss Mars, were you?
No, I believe that there were still unanswered questions.
You believe that she was hiding something, right?
I did, yes.
So you went and searched her room anyways, right?
That's correct.
Now, Mr. Bond, when you were searching Miss Mars's room, there was no one else in there, was there?
At that time, no.
Nobody came in while you were in there?
No,
You were alone in that room the whole time, right?
that's correct.
Now, Mr. Bond, before I continue, I want to make a distinction. When you said that you collected forensic evidence, that was actually Ms. Khan and the Midlands Police Department, isn't that right?
That's correct. I was present during that forensic search.
Right, Mr. Bond, you couldn't collect forensic evidence because you didn't have gloves on.
On August 15th, you mean?
Yes.
I was not wearing gloves, no.
Now, Mr. Bond, you mentioned on your direct examination you found an email in Miss Mars's room, right?
Right, more specifically on our computer.
Right, so you went in Miss Mars's room and you grabbed her computer, right?
I opened the computer, yes.
Right, you tried to log in?
Well, I succeeded in logging in.
Right, and then that's when you took the photo.
After I found the email, yes.
Right. Mr. Bond, nobody was in the room when you did that, right?
That's correct.
Mr. Bond, so if you would have planted those chlorangemine bottles in the bag, no one would have seen it.
I don't plant evidence, sir.
If you would have wiped your fingerprints down from the whole room, no one would have seen it, right?
I don't falsify evidence, sir.
Mr. Bond, you're actually aware that Detective Khan did a fingerprint analysis, right?
That's correct.
In this fingerprint analysis, he swiped the whole room, all of Lee Manor, looking for any fingerprints and evidence that could help him, right?
Well, she examined any relevant exhibits in this case.
Right, and some of those exhibits were in Miss Mars's room, right?
Right, specifically the bag and the bottle of chlorandramine.
A room that you were in alone, right?
That's correct.
But Mr. Bond, you told me you didn't have any gloves on, right?
That's correct.
Mr. Bond, you're aware that the fingerprint analysis didn't have your fingerprints anywhere in that room.
That's correct. I only touched the computer.
Well, Mr. Bond, your fingerprints didn't come up when they scanned all of Miss Mars's room, a room that you had no gloves on, right?
Well, the analysis was focused on the bag and the bottle of chlorandramine. Again, of the objects in the room, I only touched the computer.
And now I want to focus on opportunity.
Certainly.
We talked about in your direct examination. Mr. Bond, you're aware that in that fingerprint analysis report, it said that it looked like someone had tried to wipe away fingerprints, right?
That's not true.
Objection, hearsay.
Response?
Your Honor, this is not hearsay. Opposing counsel on direct examination laid the foundation that he had reviewed this report and used this report as knowledge when he came to the conclusions he made in this case. Moreover, Your Honor, this report, Exhibit 6, is already pre-admitted, and Mr. Bond has reviewed this exhibit before trial started today, so it's within his purview of knowledge to testify.
Yeah, I'm going to overrule it because this is Exhibit 6, which was admitted, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Bond, are you telling us today that in that fingerprint analysis, that they didn't determine that it looked like someone had tried to wipe fingerprints off that bag?
There were smudges consistent with it having been touched, but there was no evidence consistent with fingerprints being wiped away.
A room that you were in alone. Isn't that right?
Objection asked and answered for the third time.
Sustained.
No further questions.
Okay, any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Bond, did you plant evidence in Drew Mars's bedroom?
I would never plant evidence, ma'am.
And in Detective Khan's report, I just want to be clear on the language that was used there in reference to the fingerprint analysis. Did it say that someone had tried to wipe fingerprints off of evidence?
No, what was reported was smudges consistent with having been touched, but that didn't yield a usable fingerprint.
So just to be absolutely clear, was the word wipe in that line?
No.
Thank you, Mr. Bond. No further questions.
Can you recross?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. So, Mr. Bond, you can be excused.
Certainly.
And does the plaintiff have any other witnesses?
No, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff rests our case in chief and requests a brief recess.
Okay, so we will now take a 5-minute recess, a 5-minute break. Judges, please remember that this video is being publicly broadcast via YouTube live stream, and we will see you all shortly. So in 5 minutes at 11:53. Yeah. Do we have everyone back?
Looks like there's still one defense witness in the breakout room. And then I'm going to check and make sure all of our judges are back. All right, judges, if you can either send me a message in the chat or pop your video on just to make sure everybody's back. I lost track, but I think that was everybody.
Okay, so let's get going then. Since everyone's back, defense, please call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Drew Mars to the stand. May I proceed?
Yes.
Please introduce yourself to us.
Good morning. My name is Drew Mars.
What do you do for a living, Miss Mars?
I'm a live-in caregiver, so basically I'm a nurse for elderly patients, but instead of taking care of them in the hospital, I in fact take care of them at their house, giving them round-the-clock care.
Let's talk about why you're here today. Do you know Miss Agatha Lee?
Yeah, I was her caregiver for 10 years until she died.
What was your relationship with Miss Lee like?
I mean, when I was first hired, she was just my patient like any other. But I was with her and I lived with her 10 years. I took care of her for every single day over the course of 10 years. Living with someone for that long, that's a long time. She became part of my family.
Did Miss Lee have any other family?
No, she didn't have much family. She has one grandson, Stevie Rogers. From what I could tell, they didn't talk that much. They weren't that close. And Agatha even
Lack of foundation.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Yes.
Your Honor, the witness just testified that she has been living and taking care of Agatha Lee, for the past 10 years. It is well within her rationally based perception to say that from what she could tell, they didn't talk much.
Response, Your Honor.
Yes.
Your Honor, the statement that they were not that close would require some foundation as to interactions she saw or didn't see between them, letters she saw or didn't see between them. And without that foundation, it would be improper for this witness to characterize that relationship.
Your Honor, may I be heard on that?
Yeah, one last time.
Your Honor, the witness just testified that she didn't see many letters from between the two, and she didn't see them talk much. That's where the foundation is for her to say that they weren't very close. And that's well within her rationally based perception, considering her close ties to Agatha Lee and the fact that she lived with her and spent every day with her, which we've already laid the foundation for.
Okay, I'm gonna overrule the objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
So, Ms. Mars, you were saying about Stevie Rogers and Agatha Lee's relationship?
Yeah, from what I could tell, they didn't talk much. There weren't many letters, and they just weren't that close. Agatha even ended up taking Stevie out of her will.
When was Miss Rogers written out of Miss Lee's will?
That was in February of 2018.
Who was put in the new will instead?
I was shocked. Agatha put me in. I mean, Agatha and I were really close. Like I said, she was family, but I never expected something like that.
What happened after Miss Rogers was written out of that will?
Mr. Rogers, Stevie just showed up at Agatha's house totally out of the blue right at a couple months later in June of 2018. Agatha let him stay, but Agatha didn't necessarily embrace him with open arms.
Objection, speculation.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Actually, first, Ms. Rayfield, can you explain your objection?
Yes, Your Honor. For this witness to characterize how Agatha felt about Stevie's return is speculation.
Okay, response.
Yes, Your Honor. Again, we've already first of all, the witness hasn't speculated into Agatha Lee's mindset. She didn't say how Agatha Lee felt. She just said that from what she saw, Agatha Lee wasn't embracing Miss Rogers with open arms. She wasn't welcoming her home, and that's simply an observation that she has laid the foundation to make.
Okay, I'm going to overrule the objection on that ground.
Yes, Your Honor.
Miss Mars, how was Miss Rogers acting while she was staying at the house?
Stevie was very invested in Agatha. Everything Agatha did, Stevie was right there beside her. I mean, I don't know, it just felt like I was in the way or something.
You said it felt like you were in the way. How was your relationship with Miss Rogers?
I was there to take care of Agatha. She was my family. She was my patient. And I just wanted to make sure she was okay. So I was skeptical of Stevie. It seemed strange to me that he just came back around and said he had a complete turnaround. So I just tried to keep an eye out to make sure Agatha wasn't hurt and she was okay.
Did you ever see Miss Lee's relationship with Miss Rogers change?
Yeah, one day I heard a conversation between Agatha and Stevie, and it was a tense one.
What day was that?
That was August 14th of 2018, the day before Agatha was found dead.
Is this the same conversation that we just heard Mr. Rogers testify about?
It was that conversation, but it didn't happen the way that Stevie just said it did.
Well, what actually happened in that conversation?
So Stevie was talking to Agatha in her study and saying how he's so devoted to her and how he's had a complete life turnaround, and then asked to be put back in her will.
How did Miss Lee respond?
Agatha said that she wouldn't give Stevie even a penny.
Objection hearsay.
Your Honor, be heard.
Yes.
Your Honor, this falls under the, well, first of all, this falls under the hearsay exception of 8033, plan, intent, motive. The witness's statement, if she hasn't said the full thing already, may I proffer?
Yes.
The witness's statement is that Agatha said she wasn't going to give Miss Rogers a penny of that money. That's a clear plan, intent on the part of Miss Lee, and so it falls under that hearsay exception.
Okay. A response to that?
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, that statement, in order for it to be a plan or intent under 8033, would have to require some sort of following action in the future as part of a plan. That statement implies no future action and therefore does not fall under 8033.
Your Honor, may I be heard on that?
Yes, briefly.
Your Honor, under Rule 803, there's no requirement for a follow-up to a plan. It's simply a statement of intent. It doesn't matter whether or not the declarant actually followed up on it. And this statement is clearly a statement of intent, of plan.
I'm going to overrule the objection. I think it was well argued, but I'm going to overrule at this point.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. So, Ms. Mars, how exactly did Agatha Lee respond to Stevie asking to be put in that will?
Agatha said that she wasn't going to give Stevie even a penny. Not now, not ever.
What happened after that?
So they both walked out of Agatha's study, and as soon as Stevie saw me, she started glaring at me.
Did she say anything to you?
Yeah, as soon as Agatha went to get ready for lunch, Stevie just said to me, "Don't count your millions yet."
Did you know what that meant?
I mean, I knew that she wanted to be in the will, but I didn't know. I didn't know that this would happen.
You didn't know that what would happen?
That Agatha would be killed.
Miss Mars, when did you find out that Miss Lee had died?
The next morning, on August 15th, I went to wake her up with a cup of coffee like I did every morning. And that's when I found her.
What did you do?
I felt like I couldn't even breathe. I couldn't even look at her. I just ran to go tell Stevie what happened.
How did Mr. Rogers react when you told him that his grandmother was dead?
He didn't. He just took out his phone and made 2 phone calls. One to the police and one to his private investigator named Bond, who arrived at the house even before the police even did.
What did Mr. Bond do when he got to the house?
He kept asking me to search my room, and he wanted to do it alone. And he kept saying he was some sort of investigator hired by Stevie. but couldn't even show me a badge to show that he was an investigator. So I told him no.
Miss Mars, we've heard that the police found this bottle of chlorangemine in your room the week after Agatha Lee died. Is this yours?
No, I've never bought these pills. I have no idea how they got there.
Did anyone else have access to your room during that week?
I mean, I just heard Mr. Bond say that he went into my room the morning that Agatha was found dead.
What was Miss Rogers doing the morning that Agatha Lee died?
She kept following the police around, kept trying to tell them that I killed Agatha, and she kept asking for a toxicology screen, which I didn't understand.
You said that Miss Rogers was asking for a toxicology screen. Had anyone mentioned that drugs might be involved in this at that point?
No, no one said anything. I didn't know anything about the drugs at that point.
Did you and the police ever find out if drugs actually were involved in Miss Lee's death?
Yeah, when the toxicology screen came back, it said that Miss Lee or Agatha had chlorangemine in her system. It was a medicine that she was definitely allergic to.
Did anyone else know about Miss Lee's fatal allergy to chlorangemine?
Stevie did. She found out the week before Agatha was killed.
Miss Mars, who can buy chlorangemine?
Anyone. You can walk into any pharmacy and buy it. It's over the counter.
Other than you and Miss Lee, who was in the house on August 14th, 2018?
Stevie Rogers.
Thank you, Miss Mars. I have no further questions.
Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Pardon, I'm having some connectivity issues, so if things cut out or you can't hear me, just feel free to let me know.
Okay.
Ms. Mars, I just have a few questions. And again, since I'm having some issues, I may have to have you repeat a couple of answers if I'm not able to catch them. So Ms. Mars, I want to start with something that you just said on direct examination.
Okay.
You said that when Stevie found out that his grandmother had died, he called Detective Bond. Is that right?
Yes.
So do you remember being deposed before today?
I do.
And would you recognize your deposition if we were to show it to you today?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, we're displaying the defendant's deposition. Now, Ms. Mars, could you just read silently while I read this aloud?
Okay.
On line 386, you say, "I can't breathe. I was devastated. I stumbled into Stevie's room and told Stevie. I slid to the floor. I heard Stevie call the police. And pretty sure soon the police detective named Nora Khan arrived and a private detective named Bond." Did I read that correctly, Ms. Mars?
Yes.
So nowhere in there do you say that Stevie called Detective Bond?
But it says in there that Bond arrived at the scene.
Ms. Mars, I just want to bring you back to my question. Nowhere in there do you say that Stevie called Detective Bond?
Mr. Bond told me multiple times. No, but
Ms. Mars, I just need to bring you back to my question. Nowhere in your deposition did you say that
The jury.
Pardon, I couldn't hear that. Objection.
Yeah, can you repeat that?
Objection, misleading the jury.
And
Maybe heard.
Yes, sorry.
Your Honor, this is misleading to the jury as Miss Rogers just testified that she was the one who called Mr. Bond.
May I respond?
Yeah, yes, your response.
Your Honor, regardless of any previous testimony, the fact that this witness prior in her direct examination stated that she heard Stevie make 2 phone calls, but in her prior deposition stated that Stevie only made 1 phone call. This is not misleading at all to the jury. It's actually highly probative.
Okay, I'm gonna overrule the objection, but I would encourage plaintiff counsel just to move on quickly from this point.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
So Ms. Mars, again, you saw Stevie make 1 phone call?
I didn't. But Stevie said that she called Detective Bond.
Now, Ms. Mars, I want to move on to something else you said on your direct examination.
Okay.
You said that you heard Stevie repeatedly ask for a toxicology screen while he was following around the police.
Yeah.
Now, again, I want to bring up that deposition. Ms. Mars, can you show us where in your deposition you said that that happened?
Objection, misleading the jury. May I be heard?
Yes.
Your Honor, on the witness's direct examination, what she actually said is that she knew that Stevie was the one who was asking for the toxicology report. Now, Ms. Rogers just testified that she was asking for a toxicology report earlier today. That's how she knows that, not from her deposition.
If I'm correct, I heard the witness on direct say something along the lines of walking around asking about asking about doing a toxicology report.
Your Honor, I believe what she said was that she was walking around following the police, saying that Miss Mars, like accusing Miss Mars of murdering her. And then she said she also knew that Stevie was asking for a toxicology report that morning. And she knew that from the testimony today.
Your Honor, in that case, I'd love to rephrase my question.
Okay, let's do that then.
Miss Mars, can you tell us where in this deposition you said that Stevie was following around the police and saying that you had murdered Miss Lee? Can you point that out to us?
Is it okay if I pull out my deposition and look at it?
Please do.
If you look at line 42, it says, as soon as Detective Khan, or 422, you had it on the screen.
What line was that?
422.
422.
It says right here, Stevie, as soon as Detective Khan arrived at the scene, Stevie said it was murder. I thought Stevie was crazy. Detective Khan seemed to think Stevie was crazy.
Miss Mars, I just want to clarify, nowhere in this deposition do you say that Stevie said you murdered Miss Lee when the police arrived. Is that correct?
He kept saying that it was murder.
Miss Mars, I just want to bring you back to my question. Nowhere in this deposition did you say that Stevie told the police you murdered Miss Lee. Is that correct?
Yeah.
All right, now I want to move on to another lie you told Miss Mars.
Objection, affirmative.
I'm going to sustain that and strike that from the record if you rephrase.
Yes, Your Honor. I want to move on to the day that Miss Lee's will was read out. Do you remember that day?
I do.
And do you remember what you said when the will was read out?
I do.
You said, I had no idea. Is that right?
I did say that. I mean, Stevie was saying that there was a murder. I couldn't give them chances to think that it was me. I could.
Miss Mars, it's just a yes or no question.
I did say that I didn't know, yes.
But that wasn't true, was it, Miss Mars?
Of course I couldn't tell them. They would think I'm the suspect. Obviously, I was my family.
Miss Mars, again, this is just a yes or no question. You said I had no idea, but that wasn't true.
Yeah.
Because you knew that you were the beneficiary on the will at that point.
I did.
And you knew that you stood to inherit all of Agatha Lee's wealth.
I did.
And in fact, at that time, you needed that wealth to help a sibling. Isn't that right?
When my sibling was sick and her treatment required money.
That's right. Your sibling was actually deathly ill at that time.
Yeah, she was participating in a treatment program which needed money.
And at that time, you were worried that your sibling would die before Miss Lee did. Isn't that right?
I mean, I knew that would probably happen because my sibling was deathly sick and Agatha was in good health.
So again, Ms. Mars, just to clarify, you were concerned that you wouldn't get that money in time for your sibling. Isn't that right?
I was concerned that my sibling would die, but not that I wouldn't get the money.
Ms. Mars, it's your testimony today that you weren't concerned you wouldn't get the money soon enough?
I mean, I was concerned that my sibling would die and I wouldn't have the money to save her.
So again, you were concerned that your sibling would die before Miss Lee.
Yeah.
Now, I want to move on to what happened on the day of August 14th.
Okay.
Is that all right? Your Honor, permission to display a demonstrative on the screen?
Okay, this has been shown to defense counsel prior?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay.
Now, I want to start with something that you talked about on direct examination, Miss Mars. You said that you overheard a conversation between Stevie and Agatha about Miss Lee's will, isn't that right?
I did.
So you heard that conversation that morning, and I want to talk about what happened after that conversation.
Okay.
After you heard that conversation, you drove Miss Lee to an appointment, isn't that right?
I did. She was going to lunch.
You heard Miss Lee make a call.
Sorry, I couldn't hear that.
Pardon. On the way to that appointment, you heard Miss Lee make a phone call.
Yeah, I did.
And that phone call was to a Kirby Doolittle.
Yeah.
And you know who Kirby Doolittle is.
I mean, Kirby Doolittle is Miss Lee's personal, or Agnes' personal attorney.
So after you heard Miss Lee call her personal attorney while you were taking her to lunch, you went to a pharmacy, isn't that right?
I did. I go to pharmacy about 4 times a week. I'm a caretaker. I'm a nurse.
So again, Miss Mars, that's a yes. After Agatha called her lawyer, you went to a pharmacy.
I did.
And when you were at that pharmacy, you paid in cash.
I did.
You didn't get a receipt for any of the items you purchased.
No.
And then you went home with Miss Lee.
I picked her up from lunch and then went home, yes.
Now I want to talk about what you did that night.
Okay.
Ms. Mars, you were here today for the testimony of Stevie Rogers,
I was.
and you heard Stevie Rogers testify that he saw you going into Agatha Lee's room at around 9:35 that night.
That is what Stevie said, but I was asleep at 9:30.
So just to be clear, you heard Stevie Rogers say that, though.
That is what she said, yeah. Or that is what he said, yes.
And Ms. Mars, you were able to review the autopsy of Miss Lee?
Yeah, I saw it when it was when we first got it back.
And so you know what time Miss Lee ingested a chloroandramine pill that night.
I do.
You know that it was shortly after 9 p.m. that night.
I mean, it says that she died between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m. I don't know when she took the pill.
So just to be clear, she ingested chloroandramine between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m.?
That's how she died, yes.
Thank you, Your Honor. We have no further questions.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor, brief redirect.
Okay.
Ms. Mars, why were you at the pharmacy on August 14th?
I'm a caretaker. I'm going to be a nurse. I go to the pharmacy about 4 times a week. I don't always remember what I'm getting. I'm going to the pharmacy to make sure Agatha has everything she needs.
And why did you say that you didn't know you were the inheritor of that will?
I mean, Stevie was adamant that I was the one or someone caused the murder, and
Objection, speculation.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Yes.
Your Honor, it's already been on the record today that Stevie was in fact adamant to the police that there was a murder, that she was telling the police that there was a murder.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I'm going to sustain your objection in part. I think the witness said that Stevie was adamant that she was the murderer, but I think the only thing that's come out is that somebody had murdered. So sustained in part, overruled in part. Yeah.
Motion to strike that part, Your Honor.
Yes.
Yes,
And
Your
you
Honor.
can re-ask the question.
Ms. Mars, just based on your observations, how was Miss Rogers acting after Miss Lee's death?
Stevie was adamant that Miss Lee's death was a murder, and I thought that she was saying that I did it. I just didn't want to be caught up in all of this. Agatha was my family. I couldn't ever do this.
Would you ever have killed Miss Lee for her money?
No, she was my family, just like my sibling was.
Thank you, Ms. Mars. I have no further questions.
Any recross?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. So, Ms. Mars, you're excused. And then does the defense have any other witnesses?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Rhian Cabrera.
Okay. And you can proceed when ready.
Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury, Mr. Cabrera? Mr. Cabrera, your mic is muted. Yeah, mute. You gotta go to the bottom right-hand corner. It should be unmute.
Oh, I'm sorry, Sonny. I don't know how to work this Zoom of room situation y'all got going on here.
It's okay.
But yeah,
we're all learning. We're all learning, Mr.
doing.
Cabrera.
Thank you.
Could you introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Oh yes, my name is Mr. Rhian Cabrera. How you doing today?
I'm good. Could you tell us what you do for a living?
Well, yes, I'm an author. I write books, and I've probably been writing books longer than libraries been around. So I've written plenty of books, and I also do biographies.
How are you involved in today's case?
Well, I'm really close friends with a great mystery author, Agatha Lee. Yes, she's quite the cracker, by the way. We had the best of time together and became very close personal friends as I wrote her biography. And I actually saw her the day before she passed on August 14th.
Yes. Cabrera, let's rewind a little. How did you meet Miss Lee?
Well, it's hard for an author like me to, stay on the scene. So I had to get my son and his grandson, and he helped me set up one of them, the Twitter profile to send a direct message on Twitter. And so I sent a message to Agatha on Twitter, and we set something up. It took her about 3 years to respond. Maybe I figured she was probably just new at this like me.
What did she say when she responded?
Well, she said that she thought I'd be a good person to do the biography. I up and moved to Midlands and went right down to start working with her. We hit it right off.
Can you talk a little bit more about your relationship with Miss Lee?
Well, yes. Agatha and I became very close. At first, it started, with the hello, Agatha, how are you doing today? And quickly, we just started joking, and I would have to say stuff like, Agatha, you can't say that. He could be your grandson. So we eventually became really close. I talked to her a lot all the time, interviews, and I learned a lot about her personal life. I've gone to her house plenty of times, so our relationship was pretty close, if you would ask me.
You mentioned that you went to her house. Was she the only one that lived there?
No, she lived with the Miss Drew Mars, her caretaker. She's a wonderful lady.
Who is Drew Mars?
Well, she's her caretaker. Miss Drew Mars took her and drove her everywhere. She cooked and cleaned for her, but she was a nice lady. We would play games with her as well. And she brought me some vitamin pills a couple times as well. Miss Drew Mars, she's top of the line.
Can you tell us a little bit about the relationship between Drew Mars and Agatha Lee?
Well, yes, they have lived together for quite some time. Both of them had told me that they lived together for over 10 years by themselves together. She clearly trusted the young lady. She had her all around the house all the time, running her errands and doing things of that sort. Agatha said they were like family. I remember one time she told me that Miss Drew Mars was actually in her will.
Would you recognize that will if I showed it to you today in court?
Yes, it is a little difficult for me to see, but I may be able to if you zoom it up real good.
Okay, we'll put it up on the screen, and if you can't read it, I'll help you out, Mr. Cabrera.
All righty. Okay.
Can we have the will?
Yes. Okay, let me see here.
You see that okay, Mr. Cabrera?
Let me see. Okay, I see it. I see it now.
And does this look like an accurate? I'm sorry. Does this look like a true and accurate copy to you?
Yes, it does.
And now, Mr. Cabrera, who does this will say is the sole inheritor?
Well, hold on now. Oh, this has a zoom function. Okay, I see that. It looks like this is the one for Drew Mars. She said to devoted and beloved caretaker Miss Drew Mars. Oh, she also mentioned in here to exclude her grandchild, Mr. Stevie Rogers. So that's what I can see here right now, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Cabrera.
No
now, who
problem.
is Stevie Rogers?
Well, Stevie Rogers was Agatha's grandchild. You know, I had never really met Stevie Rogers. Agatha wasn't really talking about Stevie Rogers much either. So, you know, anytime she did bring up Stevie Rogers, it wasn't the most pleasant conversation, if you know what I mean. It was, yeah.
Now, when you were working on Miss Lee's biography,
Lack of foundation, seeing as this attorney's next question wasn't following up on how exactly those conversations were unpleasant.
Response to that?
Your Honor, I believe that the witness gave enough foundation in his response. He talked about how every time that they had conversations, it seemed that Miss Lee didn't feel very amped to talk about it. I think he described the outward characteristics of Miss Lee, which allowed him to make the conclusion on why he thought it was unpleasant.
Response, Your Honor?
Yeah, briefly.
Well, to characterize the conversation the plaintiff had with the grandmother as unpleasant requires a little more foundation than just Agatha Lee's lack of talking about Stevie Rogers.
I just want to clarify. I think what the witness is saying is that his conversation with Agatha Lee about Stevie Rogers was unpleasant. Am I right about that?
Yes, Your Honor. Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, so I'm going to overrule the objection at this point.
Okay, Mr. Lee, I'm going to ask you that question again, okay?
Okay, go on ahead.
Now, did she ever talk about Stevie Rogers? Did you guys ever talk about Stevie Rogers?
Yes, you see, we didn't talk about Stevie much. It actually seemed to be a sore spot for Miss Agatha. But like I said, whenever she talked about it, it wasn't, the most pleasant conversation.
Mr. Cabrera, did you ever get a chance to interact with Stevie Rogers?
The whole time that I had been working with Agatha, I never saw Stevie Rogers come and visit. She never talked about a call or a letter from Stevie Rogers. But one day I was supposed to pick up Agatha to go meet somewhere for, a coffee or play some bingo later and just hang out. And there Stevie Rogers was. I was confused why Stevie Rogers had just shown up.
Now I want to transition into the days leading up to Agatha's death. Is that okay with you?
Yes, it is. Go on ahead, sir.
When was the last time you saw Miss Lee?
Well, I didn't know it was going to be the last time that I saw her, but I saw her on August 14th, and we were going out for a picnic.
How was your picnic that day?
Well, okay, things didn't seem as they normally do. Me and Agatha, normally we get into the car and it's on. And we hooting and hollering and throwing jokes back at each other and all that good stuff. But as soon as I got into the car this time, I was making jokes and Agatha wasn't really responding. And I figured she just didn't seem to have the same energy. So I figured something was wrong. And I asked her about that.
Did she tell you what was wrong?
Yes. And she told me that she hoped everything was okay with Stevie and she loved Stevie.
Wait, so you had an objection? Can you repeat your objection?
Yes, Your Honor, that was an objection to the hearsay statements of Agatha Lee.
Okay, and then defense advocate, can you proffer the statements and then respond to the hearsay?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Cabrera, if I was allowed to proffer, is going to say that Miss Lee had to tell Stevie Rogers no, and I hope that he forgives me. Those are the statements that Mr. Lee is going to elicit in this question. And now, Your Honor, in the response to the hearsay objection, Your Honor, I had to tell him no, and I hope he forgives me, have no inherent truth value. And it's inconsequential to the defense whether actually Miss Lee had to tell him something or if she actually forgave him. This just goes to the subsequent action and the defense's contention that once Mr. Rogers heard that conversation, that he then enacted his plan to murder Miss Lee.
Okay, and then the plaintiff, what's your response to the not being offered the truth of the matter?
Yes, Your Honor, this is certainly being offered for the truth of the matter asserted, which is the crux of the defense's case. Saying that Agatha had to tell Stevie no, this is in reference to that conversation in which defense is claiming that actually Stevie was rejected from being put into Agatha's will. That's the truth.
And defense, one last response to that.
Your Honor, I stand by my previous objection. Not objection, my response, I'm sorry.
Okay. This one's a tough one. I'm gonna let it in, but I might be overruled on appeal. So overruled.
Mr. Cabrera, could you repeat what she said to you? Mr. Cabrera, you're muted again.
Silly me. Yes, so I had asked Agatha if there was anything wrong, and she said that she hoped Stevie forgave her, and that she really was sorry, and that she hoped Stevie still loved her, but that she had to tell him a no about something. And it seemed rather serious, she didn't really want to keep talking about it, so we tried to mind and keep on having a good day, keep on keeping on.
Ms. Cabrera, was that the last time you saw Miss Lee?
It was. I was able to ask her everything that I ever could have, but at this age, people do go and come and go, but Agatha was a near and dear friend of mine, so it did hurt to see that she had an early death. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cabrera. At this time, the defense has no further questions.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor.
How you doing, miss?
I'm doing well, thank you.
No problem.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
Yes.
Now, thanks for being here today, Mr. Cabrera. I just have a couple more questions.
Okay.
Okay. Now, I want to start by talking about that conversation you mentioned you had with Agatha Lee on August 14th.
Oh, yes.
Now, I just want to be very clear for the jury that you aren't actually sure what Agatha was talking about.
Oh no, I just know that it seemed pretty serious, and she hopes Stevie forgave her about something. So that's all I know. All I said was all I know, miss.
And Agatha actually said in that conversation she loved Stevie.
Yes, and that she hoped Stevie loved her too, that it was a tough one.
All right, and I want to talk a bit more about the defendant's relationship with Miss Lee, all right?
Okay, let's go right ahead.
Now, you mentioned that you've actually seen them interact before when you went over to Miss Lee's house.
Well, yes, like I said, we used to hang out all the time. We'd watch movies together and things of the such. Miss Drew Mars was quite a good company.
Well, you even said that you thought the defendant and Miss Lee had a level of trust together.
Now, yes, just definitely. They lived together, and it seemed like she trusted the woman.
You would even say that that level of trust was implicit.
No, I wouldn't use those words now, miss. I would say that they trusted each other like any caretaker and person would, miss.
I want to be clear, Mr. Cabrera, you would use the word implicit to describe their level of trust, yes or no?
I mean, I have probably used the word implicit to describe it, but I was just saying that they trusted each other. I know you're into the technicalities of it all. Excuse me, miss. Go
right,
on
Mr.
ahead.
Cabrera. And you've actually seen the defendant bring pills for Miss Lee.
Well, yeah, she's brought me some pills too. She gave me my vitamin C a couple of times. Miss Drew Mars does that type of thing. It's a job.
Well, I just want to focus in on when the defendant brought Miss Lee pills, all right?
Well, yes, I've seen that countless times, miss.
Right, and when that happens, well, the defendant would hand Miss Lee her pills and she would just take them.
Yep, nothing much to it.
Right, not without hesitation.
No, nothing like that. No, they had.
Without
It
even
seemed pretty,
excuse me,
okay.
without even asking what those pills were.
Well, yes, I mean, I'm sure Agatha had to have known the pills she was telling her caretaker to give her. I mean, she wasn't going at the mine. She had a good one.
Sure, but I'm not asking what you think Agatha might have thought, just
Oh.
what happened in that interaction. And Miss Lee would have never asked what those pills even were.
No, she didn't. It looked like they had it all together.
You even saw Miss Lee tell the defendant, "You know, I'll take anything you hand me."
Objection, Your Honor, misleading. Might be heard.
Sure.
Your Honor, now opposing counsel has laid the foundation that the exchange that he saw with these pills were of her medicine. Now opposing counsel is trying to misconstrue Agatha Lee's words when she's referring to the medicine that Drew Mars gives her to further uphold their contention that Drew Mars replaced it with poison. Now, this statement was made specifically in reference to her daily medication. For opposing counsel to make the insinuation to the members of the jury and the finder of fact that this statement could have been also in reference to any pills that Ms. Mars gave her is misleading to the jury.
Response, Your Honor.
Yeah, brief response.
This is not substantially going to mislead the jury. It's extremely probative to hear how the defendant in today's case would give Miss Lee pills and she would just take them.
May I respond?
Hey, I'm going to agree with plaintiff counsel here. I don't think it substantially has any substantial harm of misleading the jury. I think that's kind of the point, actually, a little bit. So I'm going to overrule your objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Cabrera, you actually heard that Miss Lee once said, "You know, I'll take anything you hand me."
Yeah, she said, "Stop the pleasantries, all the seriousness and all that." It seemed to be a joke, Miss. Yeah.
Well, I'm just asking what was said. And Miss Lee said,
Yeah, that was
"You
said.
know, I'll take anything you hand me," to the defendant.
Yeah, it wasn't as serious as all that, but yes.
All right, Mr. Cabrera, I want to talk a little bit about why you're here today.
Okay, let's go right ahead.
Now, you're here because in exchange for your testimony, the defendant offered you some of Agatha's books.
Well, no, ma'am. I'm here today because I'm here to testify about anything that I know. But yes, me and Drew Mars did have a conversation about some books because Agatha told me before she had gone, before she passed, that she had some unwritten books that she'd like me to read. So, me and Drew Mars did have a conversation about that, yes.
Well, I just want to break down that conversation. 2 months ago, the defendant called you up on the phone.
Yes, we did talk on the phone.
And that phone call was when she asked you to testify here today.
Well, yeah, we talked about it being a tough situation and all, being accused of some such things like that. And I told her I would do it.
Right, so same phone call. That's also where she offered you anything of Agatha's that you might like.
Yeah, but she was just wondering if there was any memorabilia or memento that I would like. So I told her about the books that Agatha told me to read. So yeah, we did talk about this, man. We did.
That's right. You told the defendant you would like Miss Lee's unpublished works.
Yeah, I did tell her about the books I wanted to read. Agatha was only a one-hit wonder, but she was not a one-trick pony. Okay, I wanted to read the rest of the books.
Well, Mr. Cabrera, you're a writer yourself. You know that those books are worth millions of dollars.
Well, I wouldn't even try and calculate it, and I have no intentions of doing anything with the books at all other than read them. That's what Agatha and I, that's what she told me. They would just be pleasant reminders of my good friend Agatha. So that was all I was worried about, miss.
I'm not asking what you might do with those books, Mr. Cabrera, just that you think as a writer, they could be worth millions of dollars.
Objection,
well, yes.
Objection, Your Honor. Asked and answered, might be heard.
No, I'm gonna overrule your objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Cabrera, you know as a writer that Agatha Lee's unpublished works, well, they could be worth millions of dollars, right?
Well, I'm not a numbers guy, miss, but they could, her first book was worth a lot of money. So, but like I said, I was just planning on reading this.
And so, Mr. Cabrera, if this trial ends and the Drew Mars is still in possession of those books, they would go to you.
Well, yes, they would. I hope so. If Miss Drew Mars would be so kind, I hope she would give me the books. Yes.
And Mr. Cabrera, you're here testifying today for the defense.
Yes, ma'am.
And you know that if the defendant loses this trial, well, those books aren't going to go to her.
Well, yeah, maybe me and Stevie can work something out too. I don't know, but that doesn't really matter to me. It's just a favor, ma'am.
Well, Mr. Cabrera, the only person here today who's talked to you about giving you something Agatha owned, that was the defendant.
Yes, if you want to put it like that, ma'am, we can.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Cabrera. I have no further questions.
And thank you, ma'am. You have a good day.
You too.
Redirect.
Briefly.
Okay.
Mr. Cabrera, if you do come in possession of those books, are you gonna sell them?
And I don't even know how to get on Facebook or any of those other things. So I don't know how I have any luck selling any books, but I'm no good with mine either. I was just planning on reading them, sir. It's just a simple conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cabrera, for your time.
No problem.
At this time, I have no further questions.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Okay. And any recross on that one question?
No recross, Your Honor.
Okay, so the witness is excused.
Thank
Does
you.
the defense have any other witnesses?
No, Your Honor. The defense rests.
Okay. So where am I in this script? Okay, so we're now going to hear closing arguments for each party. Everyone please switch back to speaker view. And plaintiff, you can proceed with closing arguments.
Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. You know I'll take anything you hand me. The person who said that is now dead. Because the person Agatha Lee said that to was the defendant, Drew Mars, who on August 14th, 2018 decided to switch Agatha's pills in order to secure her money. At the beginning of today's trial, my co-counsel, Ms. Rayfield, introduced you to the family that today's trial is all about. And that was a grandson trying to reconnect with his grandmother. Stevie Rogers decides in July of 2018 to move back in with Agatha Lee. And day by day, their relationship just grows closer and closer. So much so that Agatha Lee decides to change her will to leave Stevie everything she owns. But the problem is, members of the jury, Drew Mars overheard that conversation. And she realized she was going to be losing her millions. Because at that time, Drew Mars was the beneficiary of Agatha's will. And so that conversation, the morning of August 14th, when Stevie and Agatha agreed that Agatha's will would be changed, that sets the defendant's plan in motion. Because she realized then that she had to secure her money, so she decided to switch Agatha's pills. Now, members of the jury, I want to remind you that today's proceedings, it's not a criminal trial. But we heard a lot today about whether or not someone killed Miss Lee because the law prohibits a killer from inheriting their victim's money. And that's the Slayer statute that both counsels talked about in their opening statements. So what we're really here today to decide is whether it is more likely than not that the defendant purposefully or knowingly caused Agatha Lee's death. And we as the plaintiff today had that burden of proof to prove to you by a preponderance of the evidence, meaning more likely than not, that Drew Mars caused Agatha Lee's death. And we've proven that to you today by showing you the means, the motive, and the opportunity the defendant had to switch those pills and secure Miss Lee's money. So let's start with the easy one, because that's opportunity. Because today we only heard, both sides agreed that there were just 3 people in the house that day: Drew Mars, Stevie Rogers, and Agatha Lee. Specifically, Stevie Rogers told us that on August 14th, that night, he saw the defendant sneak into Agatha Lee's room. And that was around 9:30 at night. Members of the jury, that's the moment, the opportunity that the defendant had to switch those pills. So let's move on now to the motive. Because we heard a lot about money today, right? The $20 million estate that someone stands to inherit from Miss Lee. And money is exactly the reason Drew Mars decided to switch those pills. Because she knew she had to act before Miss Lee could call her lawyer, before Miss Lee could change the will from leaving everything to Drew Mars. And Drew Mars at the time needed money desperately, immediately, because she had a sick sibling, a fatally ill sibling who she was worried, as she admitted on cross-examination, wouldn't make it if she didn't get money soon. And so money was her motive, was her reason for deciding to enact this plan. And now let's move on to means. We heard today a timeline of what exactly happened on August 14th, the means that the defendant had. It starts after she overhears that conversation, that she's getting switched out. She knows she has to act fast. And that urgency is heightened when she realizes that Miss Lee called her lawyer. And so she goes to the pharmacy. She pays in cash. She doesn't get a receipt. What's she doing, members of the jury? She's buying chloroandramine, that deadly drug that killed Miss Lee, that deadly drug that the defendant knew as her caretaker, Miss Lee had a deadly allergy to. And so that night, well, by then it was simple. It was a switch of those pills so the defendant could secure her money. But members of the jury, defense counsel today has been claiming over and over that it was actually Stevie Rogers. But there's a glaring problem with that for 2 reasons. They're painting a false equivalence between Stevie Rogers and Drew Mars. Sure, they said Stevie had run out of his trust fund in June of 2018. But that's different from having a sick sibling you don't think you can save in time. And so Stevie Rogers, if his motive really was money, he didn't have that urgency, that immediacy of needing money now. Stevie Rogers, I mean, he could have stuck it out at grandma's for just a little bit longer to win back her affection, to get a bit more money. He was living lavishly, having moved in at that mansion. And Stevie Rogers, if he didn't need money immediately, well, we all know as regular people, there are so many things you can do to get a couple more bucks. Stevie told us he could have sold his car. He still had assets. He still had cash. Could have sold a few watches. He could have gotten a loan. He could have gotten a job at the local Dairy Queen. He could have taken any kind of interview offer from someone who was interested in relatives of a famous author. Members of the jury, it's just not reasonable to claim that Stevie Rogers was in dire need of money because he wasn't, not in the way that Drew Mars was. And that brings me to my second point. And that's that Drew Mars is not similarly situated to Stevie Rogers. No, Drew Mars was the beneficiary of Miss Lee's will. And so here's the thing, a defense counsel is alleging this massive conspiracy where Stevie tried to frame the defendant. The money of Agatha's estate wouldn't even have gone to Stevie Rogers had she died then, because of the Slayer statute. That requires that years have to go by for Stevie to jump through bureaucratic hoops, including this trial, that investigation that took months. I mean, we're 2 years removed from Agatha Lee's death, and not a single penny has fallen into Stevie Rogers' hands. Why would Stevie Rogers risk him losing a trial, him being discovered in the investigation as planting evidence? It just doesn't make sense, members of the jury, for Stevie Rogers to risk all of that to maybe get the inheritance. Whereas for Drew Mars, defense counsel's alleging that she was the one in the way because she was the one in the will. The thing is, there was nothing in Drew Mars's way of benefiting from that will because she was already in it. And so you have to admit, this was some really convenient timing for Drew Mars. Because on the morning of August 14th, she overhears that conversation that she's being written out of the will. That was in the morning. Agatha Lee is dead by evening. Members of the jury, you have the power today to stop a killer from profiting off of her victim's death. Don't let her get away with that. Find in favor of the plaintiff. Thank you.
Thank you, plaintiff's attorney. Defense, are you ready for closing statements? Closing arguments.
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court, Ms. Song, members of the jury. There is one thing that we need to address before we go any further here today. Before I respond to Ms. Song's closing, before I go through the evidence, before I address the weight of what the plaintiff is asking you to do, there is one thing that you and I need to be clear on. This, right now, us being in this courtroom today is the final step in Mr. Rogers' plan. The plan that he has been carrying out against Miss Mars for the past 2 years. Miss Mars is the one in the way because she's the one in the will. That has to be addressed because it means that every piece of evidence that Miss Song just used to support her case was created and planted by the same people who testified for her today. And that's a problem for the plaintiff because they came into this courtroom with a burden to prove their case by a preponderance of the evidence. That means they had to prove to you that the most likely explanation for what happened to Miss Lee is that Miss Mars killed her. Members of the jury, the law is very clear. They have to prove that to you using credible evidence, evidence that you can trust. And when you look at the plaintiff's evidence in context, you see that you can't trust the people who are telling their story. When you look at the whole picture, you see that their story, their evidence, all supports the fact that this is all a part of Mr. Rogers' plan to inherit that money. So let's go through that evidence, starting off with that will that the plaintiff is talking so much about. They want you to focus on the fact that it's Drew Mars's name in that will. But what they don't want you to focus on is that before Drew Mars, it was Stevie Rogers. So when Miss Mars was written into that will, Mr. Rogers lost over $20 million. So let's take a step back and look at the timing of this, because it's important that the first time Mr. Rogers tries to visit his grandmother in almost a decade isn't just right after he's written out of that will, it's right when his trust fund runs out. Members of the jury, it is not a coincidence that he only decides to patch things up with his rich grandmother right when he goes broke. So that brings us to him going to his grandmother's house. He went there because he wanted to be the one in that will. So it makes sense that just a month into him being there, they had a conversation about the will. But the thing is, Mr. Rogers isn't telling the truth about how that conversation went down. We know that because every other witness who has testified about that conversation today told us that Miss Lee told Mr. Rogers he wasn't getting a cent of that money. We didn't just hear that from Miss Mars, we heard it from Mr. Cabrera too. He talked to Miss Lee right after that meeting, and she wasn't saying, oh, Miss Stevie will be so happy, I put him back in the will. She was saying, I hope Stevie forgives me. So then what? Is Mr. Rogers lying about how that conversation happened? Because if that conversation didn't go the way he wanted, all of a sudden, it's not Miss Mars with the motive here. The motive to switch the pills to secure the money, it's him. And we know that because Mr. Rogers admitted on the stand today that he knew that if that conversation didn't go his way, he had another way to get that money because he knew about the Slayer statute. He knew that if he could frame Miss Mars for the murder of his grandmother, then he could get everything. Members of the jury, Miss Mars may have been the one in that will, but that statute was the one thing that could get her out of the way. So let's talk about how he planned to do that. Because Mr. Rogers didn't just know about that statute, he also knew about his grandmother's fatal allergy to chlorandramine. And when he found out about that allergy, he wasn't just finding a way to kill his grandmother, he was finding the perfect way to kill his grandmother and frame Miss Mars. Because he knew that Miss Mars was the only other person who knew about that allergy. And Mr. Rogers also knew that if he bought chlorandramine, it couldn't be traced back to him. I mean, just look at that bottle. That's an over-the-counter medicine. It doesn't have a label on it saying where it was bought, who bought it. It doesn't even have any fingerprints on it. They couldn't find any fingerprints to tie it to anyone in this case. So how do we know then that Mr. Rogers used chlorandramine to kill his grandmother? Well, because he showed his hand. Mr. Rogers was the one who was insisting on that toxicology report before anyone had even mentioned that Miss Lee might have been poisoned. How did he know before the police that Miss Lee was poisoned? Is he a better investigator than them? Or did he have something to do with that poisoning? Members of the jury, he did. And we know that. Because wasn't just, so why would he, members of the jury, if Mr. Rogers was the one who committed this murder, why would he lead the police in the right direction? Because he wasn't leading them to himself, he was leading them to Miss Mars. Because right when he was insisting on that toxicology report, he had Mr. Bond planning that bottle of chlorandramine in Miss Mars's room. Now let's think about this. Mr. Bond was in that room alone the morning of August 15th. Mr. Bond was paid $30,000 by Mr. Rogers for his help in this case. $30,000, which, by the way, he hasn't gotten yet before he testified in this case. And it doesn't make sense that those pills would have belonged to Miss Mars. I mean, are we supposed to believe that Miss Mars would have went through the trouble of wiping down that pill bottle for fingerprints, just to then keep it in a bag in her own closet? And then that she would keep it there for a week after she was told that her room was going to be searched just for the police to find it? What actually makes sense here is that the only reason that pill bottle was found in her closet was because she had no idea it was there in the first place. It was because Mr. Bond planted it there by Mr. Rogers' instruction only after Mr. Rogers had already led the police straight to that drug. Members of the jury, this is the whole picture. This is what the plaintiff was supposed to show you. When looking at the whole picture destroys the credibility of their evidence, they have failed to meet their burden. Up until this point, Mr. Rogers has gotten exactly what he's wanted. Everything has gone according to plan. There's one thing he didn't consider. He thought that Miss Mars was the only one standing in the way of him and that money, but that's not entirely true. Now, the only thing standing in the way between him and that money is you. So deliver a just verdict, the only verdict that the evidence demands. Find for the one in the will. Find Miss Mars not liable. Thank you.
Thank you, defense counsel. Plaintiff, is there a rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Yes.
Now, defense counsel wants to talk credibility. We caught the defendant in lie after lie. She said that Stevie Rogers followed the police around on August 15th, demanding a toxicology screening and an autopsy. Not true. She said that she had no idea she was in that will when the will was read in August 2018. She's known that for months. She says it here in this email dated February 1st. Agatha just told me she changed her will to leave everything to me. We're talking millions of dollars. This is going to totally change my life. Members of the jury, the defendant was the one in the will, and she arrogantly thought that there would be nothing in her way. Members of the jury, nod if you have anything to say about that. Stop the defendant from profiting off of killing Agatha Lee. Find her liable. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I guess that's it. Judges should complete and submit their ballots, and everyone should stay on until everyone has submitted their ballot, and then we'll do brief comments, and the bailiff will now take over to make sure the ballots are submitted.
I'm waiting for word from the tab room that they've stopped the live stream first.
Okay.